My mother used to fold dollar bills into the shapes of birds. I don't know when she learned to do it. I never asked, and that is the kind of thing you spend the rest of your life regretting. The questions you didn't ask when the person who could answer them was still in the room with you. But she did it, consistently and quietly, throughout my entire childhood. Standing at the kitchen counter after dinner with whatever bills she had, folding and creasing with a focus that I mistook for habit and only much later understood was meditation. A way of touching something frightening, money, the lack of it, the constant calculus of it, and making it into something else. Something that could fly away if you opened your hand. She kept them in a glass jar on the windowsill above the sink. Cranes mostly, though sometimes she attempted swans. By the time I was 10 there were maybe 40 of them in that jar. Catching the light when the afternoon came through the window, these small green and gray birds made from money we didn't really have to spare. I used to look at them and think they were beautiful without understanding they were also a coping mechanism. Without understanding that my mother was doing, every single evening after she washed the dinner dishes, the only version of financial management she had available to her in a life that had given her very few choices. I didn't understand a lot of things then. That's what this story is about, really, the vast geography of what I didn't understand, and the specific, brutal, clarifying process by which I finally did. Let me go back to the beginning because the beginning is important, and because the beginning of my story is actually my parents' story, and they deserve to have it told with care. My father's name was Frank Adler. He was born in 1951 in a small town in western Pennsylvania called Colton, the third of 4 children, son of a man who worked the mines and a woman who took in sewing. He was not a remarkable student, but he was a remarkable person, the kind of man who remembered every detail of every conversation he'd ever had, who could fix almost anything mechanical with a patience that seemed inexhaustible, who had a laugh that you felt in your own chest when it happened. He loved baseball and terrible science fiction novels and the particular moment just before a thunderstorm when the air changes and the world goes very still. He met my mother, Diane Horvath, when they were both 23, at a dance at the Knights of Columbus Hall in a town called Millhaven, where Frank had relocated for a job at an automotive parts plant. Diane was the daughter of a Hungarian immigrant father and a second-generation Irish-American mother, and she had dark eyes and a quality of attentiveness, a way of listening that made you feel that what you were saying was the most interesting thing anyone had said that day, that Frank later described as the first thing he noticed and the last thing he ever stopped being grateful for. They married in 1976. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable in the specific way of working-class couples in the mid-70s, when a factory job and careful management could still build something resembling stability. Frank worked the line and was promoted to supervisor within 3 years. Diane worked at a department store until my older brother Pete was born in 1978 and then stayed home because that was what you did, because childcare cost more than she made, because the math only ran one direction if you were trying to hold things together. I was born in 1982. Pete was 4. By then, the automotive parts plant where Frank had worked for nearly a decade was in the early stages of the slow economic deterioration that would, within 3 years, gut the entire region the way a frost guts a garden, completely, invisibly, right down to the roots. Frank lost his job in 1984. I was 2. Pete was 6. The plant didn't close all at once, it shed workers in waves like a drowning ship shedding ballast, and Frank was in the second wave, which he always said was worse than the first because the first wave got the sympathy and the second wave got the silence. I'm going to tell you what happened after because it's important, and because I only know the full shape of it now, not because I lived it consciously as a 2-year-old, but because I pieced it together over years from what Frank and Diane told me, from what Pete remembered, from documents I found after my father died, and from the particular archaeology of a childhood home that contains, in its objects and its habits and its silences, the full record of what a family survived. What happened was, they lost almost everything. Not all at once, which would have been terrible, but also in some ways cleaner. They lost things incrementally, over the course of about 2 years, in the way that incremental loss is in some ways harder than sudden loss because there is no single moment of disaster to organize your grief around, no clear before and after, just a long slow dissolving of the things you built, one by one, the way a house takes on water in a flood, first the basement, then the first floor, then you are standing on the stairs watching the waterline rise and there is nothing to do but keep going up. They lost the car first. Then, when Frank couldn't find work in Millhaven because the entire region was losing the same jobs at the same time, and there were no jobs to find, they made the decision to move. To load everything they owned into a rented truck and drive to Columbus, Ohio, where Diane's cousin Nora lived and had a spare room and had said, "Come. Just come, we'll figure it out." They left in January of 1985, in a rented truck in the cold, Pete in the cab between his parents, me apparently asleep in a car seat that Pete has described to me multiple times as the most depressing thing I've ever seen. A baby car seat wedged against all your parents' furniture in a moving truck in January in Ohio. They moved into Nora's spare room. All four of them. Frank and Diane in a twin bed, Pete on a cot, me in a portable crib. For 6 weeks while Frank looked for work and Diane tried to hold the fragile, frightened thing of their marriage together in the specific way that women have historically held frightened marriages together. By sheer relentless willingness to keep going, by refusing to let the fear become a conversation, by putting food on a table that wasn't theirs and reading bedtime stories in a voice that didn't shake. Frank found a job in March. Night security at a warehouse. It paid 60% of what the plant had paid. They found an apartment, 2 bedrooms, 3rd floor, radiator heat, a landlord named Mr. Petrov who was suspicious of families with young children but needed the rent more than he needed his suspicions. They moved in with a collection of second-hand furniture and mismatched kitchen things, and the particular dignity of people who have come through something humbling and are starting over, and are determined to make it look less like starting over than it is. This is the world I grew up in. I want to be accurate about what that means, because grew up poor covers a range of experiences, and I don't want to over-dramatize mine or under-acknowledge someone else's. We were not in crisis. We were not food insecure in any extended way, though there were periods when the food was limited in its variety, and the dinners were more creative than abundant. We did not go without heat or electricity, though I remember specific months, December, always December and February, when the heat was turned down low enough that we wore our heaviest socks inside the apartment and the windows ran with condensation. We were not in danger. We were in the particular kind of precariousness that doesn't read as emergency from the outside but that, from the inside, feels like walking a balance beam, the constant low-level awareness that everything requires calibration, that there is no margin, that the wrong month or the wrong bill or the wrong piece of luck could put you back in Nora's spare room or somewhere worse. Frank worked the night security job for 2 years and then got a job driving a delivery truck, which paid better and had benefits, which was the word I heard most often in the conversations my parents had after they thought Pete and I were asleep. Benefits, 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 said with the particular reverence that people who have been without them reserve for the word. He drove that truck for 11 years. He came home tired in the specific way of men who have used their bodies for work, deep tired, joint tired, tired in the back and the hands and the particular muscles around the eyes that get used when you're watching road for 8 hours. Diane went back to work when I started kindergarten. She found a job at a dry cleaner's downtown, which she kept for 3 years, and then a job at the front desk of a chiropractor's office, which she kept until I left for college. The chiropractor's office job was better. More consistent hours, a boss who was decent, the small but meaningful dignity of a position with a title. She was good at it. She was good at everything she decided to be good at, with the specific efficiency of a person who cannot afford to be inefficient. Pete and I shared a bedroom for the first 7 years I was alive. This is not, I should say, an unusual arrangement for people in our economic situation, and I didn't experience it as deprivation until I went to Nora's daughter Gail's house and saw that she had a room entirely to herself with a canopy bed and a desk with its own lamp and a whole section of it given over to art supplies. I came home from Gail's and looked at the room Pete and I shared. His half neat in the way of older brothers who have been told to set an example, my half chaotic in the way of 5-year-olds who haven't yet been persuaded that chaos is a problem, and I thought, we don't have enough space. I remember this thought very clearly, the accuracy of it and the way it landed in me before I had a vocabulary for what I was assessing. I didn't say anything to my mother. Children don't, usually. They absorb these comparisons and file them, and the filing changes something, adds a layer of awareness about the world's distribution of things, and sometimes that awareness becomes resentment, and sometimes it becomes motivation, and sometimes it just becomes knowledge, which is neither better nor worse than the other options, just more neutral. I grew up knowing that we had less than some people and more than others. I grew up knowing that Frank and Diane worked very hard, and that the working very hard had a cost that I observed but didn't fully register as a child. The tiredness, the restraint, the specific quality of carefulness that infused every financial decision. I grew up knowing that the glass jar of origami birds on the kitchen windowsill was important to my mother in a way I couldn't articulate. And I grew up taking most of it for granted. This is the admission that costs me the most to make, but I'm making it because it's true and because this story is, at its root, about the specific moral education of understanding what something costs after it's been given to you. I took it for granted. I took Frank's tired hands and Diane's careful grocery lists and the way they never bought anything on impulse, the way they talked through every purchase above a certain amount, the way vacations were state parks and day trips and camping and borrowed equipment. I took all of it and understood it as the background of my life rather than as the ongoing active effort of two people holding a family together against significant odds. I was not a bad child. I want to be clear about that, not because I want absolution but because accuracy matters. I was not ungrateful in any deliberate, expressed way. I didn't say I wish we had more money, or why can't we have what other kids have. I was not a child who made my parents feel their limitations by naming them. I was just unaware. In the deep structural way that children are unaware of the infrastructure of their own lives. The way you don't think about water until the tap runs dry. Pete was different. Pete was 6 when the plant closed and old enough to have a before to compare the after to. Old enough to have heard the conversations Frank and Diane thought were private, old enough to have understood, in some wordless 6-year-old way, that the move to Columbus was a retreat, that the spare room at Nora's was a form of rescue, that what was being rebuilt in the apartment on the 3rd floor was built from something that had broken. Pete was protective of Frank and Diane in a way I wasn't, watchful, considerate, careful not to ask for things. He took jobs as soon as he was legally old enough and contributed his money to the household with a purposefulness that I observed and did not, at the time, fully understand. I left for college at 18 with a partial scholarship, student loans, and a work-study assignment in the university library. I was going to be a journalist or something like a journalist. I'd always been good at writing and had spent 4 years on the high school newspaper with an intensity that my editor, a wonderful teacher named Mr. Haverford, had once described as alarming in the best possible way. I went to Ohio State 2 hours from Columbus, far enough to feel like departure, close enough to go home for holidays without the additional cost of a flight. The first time I came home from college for Thanksgiving, I noticed the jar on the windowsill. I don't know why I noticed it that particular year, having grown up with it. Maybe because I'd been away for 3 months and seeing our apartment with fresh eyes. Maybe because I was 18 and beginning the long self-conscious process of seeing my parents as people rather than as parents. But I noticed the jar and I asked my mother, for the first time in 18 years of looking at it, "Why do you make those?" She looked at the jar for a moment. Then she said, "It started when you kids were small, and I needed to feel like I had some control over the money situation. I'd take whatever bills I had and fold them into something else, so they were still there but they'd changed shape." She paused. After a while it was just habit. "I like how they look." She went back to stirring something on the stove. I went back to whatever I'd been doing. I didn't ask a follow-up question. I didn't say, "What do you mean you needed to feel like you had control?" I didn't ask what the money situation had felt like, what the early years had been like, what it had taken to keep us all fed and warm and intact. I was 18 and I had a paper to write and a boy I was thinking about and a future I was trying to build, and my mother was stirring something on the stove, and I let the conversation end where it ended. I'm telling you this because it matters. Because the not asking is as important as everything else, and because I spent years not asking, and then the asking became too late, and then I had to learn everything from the inside of my own life instead of from the archive of hers. My name is Lena Adler. I am 41 years old. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment in Columbus, Ohio, with my daughter Cora, who is 9, and a cat named Ferdinand who has opinions about everything and acts on them without hesitation. I want to tell you about how I became a person who folds things in the dark, but first I have to tell you about the decade between college and now because the decade is the shape of everything that follows. I graduated from Ohio State in 2004 with a degree in journalism and a conviction about the world that I now recognize as the particular, gorgeous, temporary confidence of someone who has not yet been significantly wrong about anything. I was good. I was genuinely good at what I did, at finding the story underneath the story, at asking the question that unlocked the room, at putting words together in the particular order that made someone feel a thing rather than just know it. I got a job at a mid-size regional magazine in Columbus called Heartland Monthly, which covered Ohio politics and culture and business, and I was good there too. I moved up faster than most people my age. I was named features editor at 27, which was the youngest the magazine had promoted someone to that role in its history. I met Owen Callaway at a political fundraiser I was covering in 2007. He was a campaign staffer, smart, sharp-shouldered, with a quality of contained energy that I found compelling before I understood that what I was interpreting as drive was actually something else, something that doesn't announce itself as what it is until you're already significantly committed. He told good stories. He was funny in a way that made you feel like you were the smart one for understanding the joke. He had a way of paying attention to you in public that made you feel like the most important person in the room, and I have since learned the hard way, which is the only way some lessons come, that this particular skill in a particular kind of person is not evidence of love but of acquisition. We were together for 2 years before I got pregnant. It was not planned. We were careful most of the time, and then we were not careful once, and the arithmetic of biology did what it does. I was 27. Owen was 31. I want to be fair here, the way I've tried to be fair about everything in this story. Owen was not a villain in the cartoonish sense. He was a specific kind of person, someone who loved the idea of commitment more than its practice, who was good at the opening chapters of things and less good at the long middle, who had a particular self-preserving instinct that expressed itself, when things became complicated, as a gentle, reasonable-sounding withdrawal. He didn't leave dramatically. He didn't say terrible things. He said, in a series of very calm, very adult conversations that began when I was 4 months pregnant and concluded about 3 months after Cora was born, that he wasn't ready, that he needed to be honest, that he cared about me but that he wasn't in a place for this, and he hoped we could be civil for Cora's sake. Civil. For Cora's sake. As if we were ending a business partnership. He relocated to Washington, D.C. for a new political consultancy position when Cora was 4 months old. He sends child support, punctually, the amount legally determined, no more. He has seen Cora 6 times in her life. He sends birthday cards that are signed simply, Owen. She calls him by his first name because she doesn't have another name for him, because Dad has not been a word that had a face to go with it, and she has dealt with this the way that children deal with the specific shape of their own lives, by accepting it as the shape, by not having another shape to compare it to, and by occasionally asking questions that cost me more than she knows to answer. I was 28 years old, newly single, with a 4-month-old daughter and a features editor job at a magazine that was, unbeknownst to any of us at the time, about 18 months from a significant downsizing. This is when I started understanding things, not all at once, not in a single moment of clarifying revelation, but gradually, in the way that real understanding comes, accruing like sediment layer by layer, as your life puts you in circumstances that you have to navigate with the actual tools you have rather than the theoretical tools you thought you had. My mother, Diane, drove to Columbus from where my parents had eventually settled, a small house in a suburb called Groveview 30 minutes east, the day I brought Cora home from the hospital. Owen was present at the birth. He held Cora once, briefly, with an expression I now read as someone completing a duty rather than beginning a love. He left for his apartment. We had never lived together. Another thing I should have read differently. And Diane drove over and sat in my apartment all afternoon and held her granddaughter and didn't say a single thing about Owen, because Diane understood that the thing I needed most was not a comment about Owen but a person in the room who was completely on my side. She came every weekend for the first 3 months. Every Saturday morning she pulled up to my building and came upstairs and held Cora and made food I hadn't had time to make and ran the laundry that had been accumulating in a pile of manageable tomorrow that had become unmanageable today. She didn't require gratitude and she didn't perform her helpfulness, didn't announce it or track it or reference it later as evidence of what she'd done. She just showed up and did the things and handed them back to me silently, and then drove home on Sunday evening, and I was, in those early months, so deep in the survival mode of new parenthood and fresh abandonment that I received this as my due rather than as the extraordinary gift it was. My father, Frank, came less often. He was still working the delivery route, though slower now, managing something in his lower back that he described as a situation, and that I understood, looking at how he moved, as something more serious than a situation. He came on Sunday afternoons and sat in my apartment and held Cora with the specific confidence of a man who raised 2 children and is not frightened of small things, and talked to her in a low continuous murmur that I could hear from the kitchen while I tried to catch up on work, his voice going on and on in the private, uncomplicated language of a grandfather telling his granddaughter about the world. I don't know what he said to her during those murmuring sessions. I wish I'd listened more carefully. He died when Cora was 2. A heart attack in the cab of his delivery truck on a Wednesday in March. His truck pulled to the shoulder of Route 40 with the hazards on, the dispatcher trying to reach him for 40 minutes before calling for help. He was 60 years old. He had been driving trucks since I was 6 years old. He had worked his body to the edge of its capacity for 34 years, and his heart had quietly, without announcement, simply used up its allotment. I'm going to let the enormity of that sit for a moment before I continue, because I think it deserves the moment. My father drove a delivery truck in Ohio for 34 years, so that his family could pay rent and have benefits and stay warm in February. He came home tired every day for 34 years and ate dinner at the table with his family and watched television in his chair, and went to bed and got up and did it again. He raised 2 children in a 2-bedroom apartment and then a small house, and he never complained, not once, not in my hearing, about what it had cost. He was 60 years old when he died. He had been retired for exactly 14 months, which he'd spent fishing with Pete and watching Cora toddle around the living room with Ferdinand, who was a kitten then and already had opinions. I cried for 3 weeks. I don't say that for drama but for accuracy. I cried every day for 3 weeks in the specific disorganized way of grief that doesn't respect schedules or professional obligations, or the fact that your 2-year-old needs you to be a functional person. Cora would find me crying at the kitchen sink and say, "Mama?" and climb onto my foot and hold my leg the way she did when she wanted to be picked up. And I would pick her up and she would pat my face with her small hand and say, "Okay, okay," in the particular murmuring voice that I recognized, in a way that hollowed me out, as the voice Frank had used with her during his Sunday afternoon sessions. She was doing the same thing he had done, murmuring comfort in a low, continuous stream. She was 2 years old and she had absorbed it from him and she was giving it back to me. I held her in the kitchen and I cried and she said, "Okay, okay," and something in me rearranged, some understanding of how things transmit, how love passes through a person and comes out the other side changed in shape but unchanged in substance. I need to tell you about the magazine because the magazine is the mechanism of the story's next turn. Heartland Monthly had been struggling for the same reasons all print journalism was struggling, the economics of the industry reshaping themselves in real time, ad revenue migrating online, circulation declining in ways that the quarterly numbers showed with a clarity that was both obvious and somehow still surprising every time you looked at it. The editor-in-chief, a woman named Beverly Crane who had built the magazine over 20 years, and who I admired more than almost anyone I've ever worked for, had been managing the decline with a combination of genuine creative effort and increasingly untenable financial triage for about 4 years. She cut the staff once in 2008, 3 positions, none of them mine, and then again in 2010 when Cora was about 18 months old. The second cut was larger. Beverly called me into her office on a Thursday afternoon with an expression I recognized as the face of someone who has rehearsed a thing many times and is still not ready to say it. She told me that Heartland was reducing its staff by 40%, that my position was being eliminated, and that she was personally sorry and professionally grateful, and that she wished things were different. I sat across from her desk and heard this with the particular quality of hearing that happens when something enters your ears and is processed by your brain before your emotional system has caught up to it. She kept talking, severance, Cobra, references, timeline, and I was nodding and saying things like, "I understand and thank you for telling me directly," and all the professional machinery of receiving devastating news gracefully was running on some background system while the actual me was sitting in a chair in Beverly's office thinking, I am 28 years old and I am a single mother and I no longer have a job. I drove home. Cora was at my mother's. Diane had taken her for the afternoon while I was at work, which she did twice a week, a thing I accepted without examining what it was costing Diane to arrange her own retired life around my schedule. I walked into my apartment, which was quiet and Cora-less and smelled like the particular still air of an empty apartment in winter, and I sat on the kitchen floor. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the light to change. Long enough for the fear to arrive fully, which it did in waves, the logistical fear first, the this is what will kind, the how long can I last on severance kind, and then deeper and more frightening the existential fear, the who am I if I'm not doing the work I was built for kind, the what does it mean to have failed at this at 28 kind. I sat on the kitchen floor and looked at the refrigerator and thought about my father. Not the specific content of his experience, I still didn't know the full shape of it, hadn't asked the questions. Just the general fact of him. The general fact that Frank Adler had sat somewhere in 1984, in the specific aftermath of losing his job, and had experienced a version of this feeling and had gotten up. Had gotten up and kept going and built something from what was left. I called Diane from the kitchen floor. I told her what had happened. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Okay, We're going to figure this out. Not, I'm so sorry first. Not the comfort before the action. She went straight to the action, and the action was we, and I have never been more grateful for a single syllable in my life. What followed was 2 years that I can only describe as the most educational experience of my life, by which I mean the most painful, clarifying, pride-stripping, humility-building, slow-working education I have ever received. It didn't feel educational while it was happening. It felt like drowning, with occasional intervals of almost not drowning that I confused for recovery. I was unemployed for 8 months. 8 months during which Cora was 18 months to 26 months old and requiring more active engagement than any human I had ever previously been responsible for. 8 months during which I applied for jobs, journalism jobs, adjacent jobs, not even close to journalism jobs, and went to interviews and sent follow-up emails and received, in return, silence or polite rejections or the particular special cruelty of an interview that went very well and produced nothing. 8 months during which I stretched the severance money with a concentration and a care I had never previously applied to money, because I had never previously had to. I learned things during those 8 months that I should have learned earlier. I learned that I had been spending money in the specific manner of someone who has a reliable income and expects to continue having it. Not extravagantly, not foolishly by any normal standard, but without the calibration that my mother had always applied, the instinctive micro-assessment of every expenditure. I had a gym membership I canceled. I had cable I downgraded. I had a habit of buying coffee every morning from a place on the corner that I replaced with making it at home, which seems like a small thing and is a small thing, and also multiplied by 22 workdays a month for 8 months was not a small thing. I had 100 small habits built on the invisible assumption of adequacy, and each one I changed was a small lesson in the infrastructure of my own financial life, which I had never examined before because examining it wasn't necessary, and now suddenly and entirely was. I called Pete one evening when Cora was asleep and I was sitting at the kitchen table with a legal pad doing the kind of budgeting that requires a legal pad rather than a spreadsheet because you need to be able to draw arrows and cross things out with a physical pen. Pete was in Chicago by then, married to a woman named Susanna who is one of my favorite people alive, working as a project manager for a construction company. He answered on the second ring and I told him what was happening. Not in crisis, just factually, the way we had always talked, Pete and I, in the economical language of siblings who know each other well enough to skip the preamble. He said, "Do you need money?" I said, "Not yet. Maybe." He said, "Tell me when yet becomes now. No ceremony about it. Just tell me." I said, "How did Mom and Dad do it? In the beginning in Columbus when everything was bad. How did they actually do it?" There was a pause. Pete was quiet for a moment in the considering way he has. He doesn't say things until he's thought them through, which is a quality I find both admirable and occasionally maddening. "Barely," he said. "They did it barely. You know, Nora's spare room was only supposed to be 2 weeks and it was 6. I didn't know the timeline. Dad cried once. In the truck when he thought no one could see. I was in the back seat and I wasn't supposed to be watching. He just put his head down on the steering wheel for maybe 2 minutes, and then he picked it back up and drove us inside. I had never heard this. I had never known this. I never told you because you were too young," Pete said. "And then you stopped asking. You went to college and you were doing your thing and it felt like ancient history. It doesn't feel like ancient history now." "No," Pete said. "It wouldn't." He told me things that evening that I've spent years adding to, supplementing with what Diane has told me since, reconstructing the full picture of those early years that I'd existed at the edges of without understanding what I was seeing. He told me about the January in 1986 when Frank's truck had a transmission failure, and they didn't have the repair money, and Frank took 2 buses to work for 3 weeks rather than tell Diane how bad the math was. He told me about the time the school called to say I needed glasses and Diane sat in the car for 20 minutes before going in to pick me up, because she was doing the calculations in her head before she could walk through the door and pretend everything was fine. He told me about Christmas of 1987 when Frank sold his baseball card collection, which was not, Pete said carefully, just any collection, which Frank had built over 30 years and which had real value and which he had clearly loved, so that Pete and I could have the things on our lists. He sold his baseball card collection. My father, who had been collecting baseball cards since he was 12 years old, sold them so that his children would not know that Christmas was hard. I sat at the kitchen table with the legal pad and I thought about the jar of birds on the windowsill. I thought about my mother's hands folding those small green cranes. I thought about the specific tenderness of people who are protecting their children from the knowledge of what things cost, and about the cost of that protection itself, and about how much of my childhood had been held up by that invisible scaffolding, and how completely I had failed to see it. "Pete," I said. "Yeah. I'm sorry I should have." "Stop," he said. "You were a kid. You were supposed to not know. That was the point. But now I'm the kid who's the parent, and I have no idea what I'm doing, and I just want to know, did it get easier? For them. Did it actually get easier, or did they just get better at making it look like it had?" Pete was quiet again. Then, "Both," he said. "Both, Lena. And neither one of those is failure. I found a job eventually. It wasn't journalism, or not exactly journalism, but it was close enough that it felt like keeping a version of myself alive that mattered. A small digital media company called Lakefront Media was starting an editorial division, and I was hired as its first senior editor, which meant I was building something from nothing, which was terrifying, and also I discovered the exact kind of work I was built for. It paid less than Heartland had at its best, but it paid, and it paid reliably, and it came with benefits. There is that word again, benefits, my parents' word, the word that means health insurance and a retirement contribution, and the sense that there is a structure holding you up that won't randomly dissolve. I worked at Lakefront for 3 years. I was good there, and I built the editorial division into something genuinely good. A staff of 7 people who were talented and worked hard and produced work they were proud of. I was their editor in the way that Beverly Crane had been my editor. Fairly, demandingly, with a commitment to helping them be better than they'd been when they arrived. During this period, Cora was between 3 and 6, which is the particular age span in which children simultaneously require the most and give back the most, this constant extraordinary exchange of need and revelation. She was funny in the specific, eccentric way of children who spend a lot of time with adults. Her vocabulary was advanced, her sense of humor was slightly too dry for her age group. She approached problems with a methodical attention that I recognized from Frank. She was in preschool and then kindergarten, and I was managing the logistics of a working single parent with the full infrastructure of such a life. The school schedules and the childcare arrangements and the backup plans for the backup plans and the constant low-grade awareness that the scaffolding holding everything up is made of human beings who all have their own lives and their own things and their own limits. Diane was a central strut of that scaffolding. She watched Cora on the days when school was out and I was working. She came on weekends when I had deadlines. She appeared reliably in the way that people who understand logistics appear before you ask, with exactly what's needed without ceremony. Cora called her Grandma Dee and had a relationship with her that I watched with something between gratitude and a complicated feeling I couldn't quite name. Something about how the love between them was immediate and uncomplicated and full-bodied. How Cora ran to Diane with a completeness of trust that I had never, as a child, been able to fully extend to either of my parents. Not because they hadn't earned it, but because I hadn't been paying enough attention. I was paying attention now. The 8 months of unemployment had opened something in me. Some aperture. And now I was seeing things I'd been looking at for years without registering. I was seeing the effort. I was seeing what it took. I was seeing my mother in her car, making calculations before she came inside. I was seeing Frank in the front of the truck with his head on the steering wheel. I was seeing the baseball cards. I was seeing the jar on the windowsill, and I was finally fully understanding what the birds meant. It was around this time, Cora was about 5, that I started asking questions. I started asking Diane about the early years, about Nora's spare room, about the move from Millhaven, about what it was like to load everything you had into a truck in January and drive toward a cousin's spare room and a future you couldn't see the shape of. I started asking about the money, about the specific practical mechanics of how she had managed, what she had calculated, where the money came from in the months when it didn't seem like it could be coming from anywhere. Diane told me things I had not known. She told them to me in the particular way she had of telling hard things, matter-of-factly, without drama, with an almost journalistic precision about the details that I recognized as a professional kinship I'd never noticed before. My mother, I realized, was a natural reporter. She had an eye for the telling detail, a memory for the specific human texture of events, a way of describing things that made you feel them rather than just understand them. She told me about a woman named Rose Janopoulos, who had lived next door to them in the Columbus apartment building and who had, twice silently without discussion, left food outside their door when things were at their worst. Pot of soup. A covered dish of something with rice. No note, just the food. She told me that Frank had wanted to insist on paying her back and she had told him they would pay it forward. And he had nodded and not said anything else, and every year after that, for as long as they lived in that building, Diane had baked Rose a cake for her birthday, because she'd learned from Nora that Rose's birthday was in November, and that she was a widow who had no family in Columbus and didn't always have someone to mark the day. A pot of soup left outside a door. A birthday cake every November for years. The economy of care between people who don't have much to spare except their time and their attention. She told me about a man at Frank's delivery company named Ray Holton, who was a dispatcher and who had, without being asked, without explanation, arranged Frank's route in the early years to be shorter and more central, which meant Frank was home earlier, which meant they didn't need as many hours of after-school care for Pete, which meant the childcare math worked when it otherwise might not have. Frank found out about it years later. Ray shrugged and said he'd been moving routes around all the time. It was his job, no big deal. But it was a big deal. It was the kind of quiet, unannounced intervention that doesn't look like anything from the outside and means everything from the inside. Did you know a lot of people like that? I asked her. People who just quietly helped? Some, she said. Enough. She looked at her coffee. You don't notice them when things are going well. You only see them when you're in it. When you're in the middle of something hard, you start to notice who steps toward you and who steps back. I thought about that for a long time after that conversation. I still think about it. This is the part of the story where the betrayal comes in. I've been building toward it and I want to tell it properly because it deserves proper telling, not because of what it took from me, though it took real things, but because of what understanding it eventually required of me, and what that understanding gave back. I have a best friend named Audrey. I have known Audrey since the third year of college when we were in the same journalism seminar and sat next to each other by accident and then by choice week after week, because she was the smartest person in the room and the funniest and the one most likely to say the thing everyone was thinking that no one was saying. Audrey and I had been close for over 15 years by the time I'm about to tell you about. She was Cora's godmother. She was the person I called from the parking lot of various places when things were happening that I didn't know what to do with. She was, in every meaningful sense, one of the central people of my life. I need to give you a little context about this period because the context is part of the story. 3 years in at Lakefront, I was offered a significant promotion, vice president of content, which was a company-wide leadership role, not just editorial. It came with a 30% salary increase, and an equity stake and responsibilities that were both exciting and legitimating in a way I had needed for a while. I said yes. I threw myself into it with the intensity one brings to things I care about, which is significant intensity. I was also, I should acknowledge, at a point in my personal life where I was beginning to think about whether I wanted to try again. Not specifically about anyone, just the general question, the abstract possibility of a person who would be a partner in the actual sense. Cora was 5 and asking me occasionally whether I had a special someone, which is a phrase she'd gotten from somewhere and deployed with the systematic precision of a 5-year-old who has identified a gap in the available data. I was 32. I was not lonely in the crying on the kitchen floor sense, but I was lonely in the more specific way of someone who had been handling everything alone for 5 years and who occasionally, late at night, felt the weight of it in a way that daytime did not reveal. I started seeing a man named Dov Hartman. Dov was a documentary filmmaker, quiet in the good way, attentive, with a steadiness that I found genuinely compelling rather than boring, which was how I'd characterize steadiness when I was 27 and should have known better. He was patient with Cora in the way of someone who genuinely liked children rather than the performed way of someone who was managing a situation. He was not trying to be frank, he had his own particular qualities and I wasn't looking for a replacement, but there was something about his willingness to be present, his lack of drama, that felt after Owen like breathing after holding your breath. Audrey introduced us. This is the relevant detail, the thing the story turns on. Audrey introduced us at a dinner party at her apartment. She had been nudging me toward getting back out there for 2 years, and she knew Dov through her work. She was in documentary distribution, and she thought we'd like each other, and she was right. She sat across the table at her own dinner party and watched us talk for 3 hours and afterward, walking me to my car, said, "So? Am I a genius?" And I said, "Possibly," and she said, "Call me tomorrow." And I did, and I told her it had been the nicest evening I'd had in a long time. Dov and I were together for a year and a half. A year and a half during which things were genuinely good, not perfect, not without difficulty, but good in the way of real things that are being honestly attempted. Cora liked him. He and I had found a particular ease with each other that didn't require effort to maintain. He was working on a film about environmental restoration in Ohio, and I would read drafts of his narration scripts and he would read drafts of my editorial memos, and we would argue pleasantly about word choices, which is, I have always believed, the most intimate form of collaboration. And then something happened that I am going to describe carefully because it is important to describe it carefully, because the person who did it is not simply a villain and the thing that happened is not simply a betrayal, and both of those truths need to exist simultaneously with the fact that it was devastating. Audrey and Dov slept together. Once, she said. Just once. In the middle of the year and a half, around month 10, when he and I had gone through a rough patch, nothing enormous, just the kind of friction that relationships have, the specific conflict of two people with different rhythms learning to occupy the same space. The rough patch lasted about 3 weeks, and then we worked through it and came out closer, as rough patches sometimes produce. And during those 3 weeks, Audrey and Dov had a night that I didn't know about. I found out 8 months later. Not from either of them. From a mutual friend named Paula, who had been at a dinner where Dov had too much wine and said something that Paula had spent 2 months trying to decide what to do with before deciding that I deserved to know. The way I found out matters to me. I've thought about it a great deal, the triangle of it, who knew and for how long and who made what choice. Paula, who barely knew me, chose to tell me. Audrey and Dov, who knew me most, had chosen not to. There is something in that inversion that I've sat with for years, something about the particular way that distance sometimes produces more honesty than closeness, because closeness has so much more to protect. I confronted Dov first. He confirmed it immediately, without attempts at misdirection, which I will say in his credit, even as I say what it cost. He said he was sorry, that it was a single terrible choice in a moment of crisis, that it had never happened before or after and would not, that he had wanted to tell me and been afraid, and that the fear had produced a silence that had become its own ongoing wrong. He was calm and honest and genuinely remorseful, and all of that was real and true, and also none of it was enough. I confronted Audrey. This was the one that broke something more fundamental. Dov I had known for 18 months. Audrey I had known for 15 years. Audrey was Cora's godmother. Audrey was the person I called from parking lots. When Audrey sat across from me and confirmed it and apologized with a specificity and a grief that I could see was genuine, she was crying before she'd finished her first sentence. I felt two things simultaneously: the specific devastation of a 15-year friendship containing something that could do this, and the terrifying absence of the floor beneath me that comes when you realize that a relationship you had stood on was not as solid as you've been standing on it, as if it were. I want to be honest about what I did with this in the years since because it matters to the story. I ended things with Dov. That was clear and immediate, and I have no regrets about it. He made a specific choice in a specific situation, and the choice told me something about what he was capable of when things were hard, and what he was capable of in that circumstance was not something I could build a life alongside. Audrey was more complicated. Is more complicated. We did not speak for 14 months. 14 months in which Cora asked about her godmother, and I said, Audrey is going through some things, which was technically true and also evasive in the way I hated in other people and had apparently inherited for my own use. 14 months in which I did not have the person I would have called about this, because she was the thing I would have been calling about, and the circularity of that loss was its own particular grief. At the 14-month mark, Audrey sent me a letter. An actual paper letter which I found in my mailbox on a Tuesday evening when I was bringing in groceries, Cora on my hip, holding a bag in each hand, and I stood at the mailboxes in the lobby of my building and looked at it and had to put the groceries down because my hands weren't steady enough. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten. I'm not going to reproduce it here because it belongs to me and because its specific contents are not what matters is the quality of it. What Audrey had written was an honest letter. Not a defensive letter, not a letter constructed to obtain a particular response, not a strategy, just an honest accounting of what she had done and why, to the extent that she understood why, and an honest accounting of what she had lost when she lost me, and a final paragraph that said she was not asking me to forgive her, only to know that she understood the specific weight of what she'd done and that she would carry it correctly. I read that letter 3 times in the lobby, and then I went upstairs and put Cora to bed and read it 2 more times. What she had written about why. This was the part that caught me and held me for a long time turning it over. She said that during that rough patch in my relationship with Dov, she had become frightened. Not for herself but for me. She had been watching me try for 5 years to hold everything together alone, and when I'd finally found someone good and begun to rely on them and then had a conflict with them, she had been gripped by a fear that they were going to end and I was going to be alone again. and she had done something stupid and irreversible in the gap created by that fear, and she knew it made no sense, and she knew that what she'd been afraid of was now the thing she'd caused, and she had been living with that specific irony every day since. This is not an excuse. I want to be clear that I read it without accepting it as an excuse. But it was true, and truth has its own weight. The thing she had done was wrong, and it had come from a real place, a frightened place, and the real place didn't make the wrong okay, but it made the wrong comprehensible in the way that human wrongness is usually comprehensible when you look at it carefully enough, as something that came from somewhere, not from nowhere, from a person who was afraid and made a terrible choice in the geography of that fear. I called her. Not to say everything was fine. Not to grant absolution. To say, I got your letter. I hear you. I can't promise you anything right now, but I want you to know I read it, and I'm thinking about it. That phone call was, I've come to believe, one of the better things I've ever done. Not because it healed everything, it didn't, and some things between Audrey and me have been permanently reconfigured, the way bones knit after a break and are not exactly as they were before, which can be okay. But because I had been given, in the year since the revelation, a view of my own capability for withholding, for punishing through absence, for protecting myself at the expense of complexity, and I recognized it with a start as something I'd inherited, some flavor of what Walter Bassett had done in the story I told you about before, and I decided consciously that I wanted to respond differently. We are still friends, Audrey and I. It is not the friendship we had before, and it will not become that. That particular version is gone, and accepting that is part of what I've had to do. But it is a real friendship, real in the way of things that know their own history, and she is still Cora's godmother, which Cora has said very clearly she needs her to remain. Here is the thing about the story I'm telling you. Here is the thing I've been building toward without quite saying. There is a twist in this story, and it is not Audrey's letter or Dov's confession or any of the external events I've described. The twist is something I found in my mother's house after she had her stroke. Diane had a stroke in the winter of Cora's 7th year. She was 63. It was minor, as strokes go. The doctors used the word minor, with a precision I've since come to understand meant it could have been much worse, and what they were comparing it to was a thing that would have ended her entirely rather than changed her in the ways it actually changed her. Her speech was affected for several months. Her left hand was less precise. She tired more easily and needed more help than she'd ever needed or asked for, and the first 8 months of her recovery were the most prolonged period of role reversal I've ever been through. Me showing up at her house, making food, running laundry, being present without announcing it, exactly as she had done for me. It was during one of these visits that I found the box. I was looking for something in the back of her closet. I don't even remember what, something administrative she'd needed, and behind a stack of old photo albums I found a shoebox that I had never seen before. The lid was taped down with the kind of masking tape that goes yellow with age, and the tape was very yellow, which told me it had been there for a long time. I brought it out and set it on the bed and looked at it for a moment. I could have set it aside. I nearly did. But something in the weight of it, something about the careful taping, made me sit down on the edge of my mother's bed and pull the tape off. Inside the box were letters, and documents, and a photograph. The letters were from Frank to Diane, written in the year they were married. I knew Frank and Diane's love story in its broad shape, the dance at the Knights of Columbus Hall, the quick engagement, the small wedding in 1976, but I had never read any of what Frank had written to Diane before they married, and I sat on her bed and read 3 of those letters and then had to stop because I was crying too hard to see. He wrote to her the way I hadn't known Frank could write, with a fullness and a tenderness that his public self, his careful, quiet public self, had never disclosed. He wrote about what he wanted to build with her, about the specific future he imagined, the ordinary beloved details of it. A kitchen with a good table, children who felt safe, Sunday mornings with no particular obligation. He wrote about his fears, about his father's hard life, about his own fear of repeating it, about wanting badly to give his family something his father hadn't been able to give his. He wrote, I know I am not much. I know I don't have what some men have to offer, but I will give you everything I have every day for the rest of my life, and I will mean it. And I think that counts for something, and I hope you think so too. I will give you everything I have every day for the rest of my life, and I will mean it. He did. He absolutely did. I am here alive because he absolutely did. I set the letters down and picked up the documents. They were financial records, old ones from the mid-1980s. Bank statements from the Columbus years starting from 1985. The numbers in them were as bad as I'd understood them to be from Pete's descriptions, but seeing them in the physical accounting of a bank statement, the actual numbers, made something different happen in my chest. It made them real in the specific way that documentation makes things real, irrefutable, undeniable, written down. And then I picked up the photograph. This is the twist. This is what I didn't know. The photograph was of two women. One of them was my mother, Diane, younger, maybe 26, which would make it about 1980. The other was a woman I didn't recognize. They were standing in front of what appeared to be a house I didn't recognize, arms around each other, squinting into the sun. On the back of the photograph in Diane's handwriting was a name and a date, Patrice, 1980. And then below that, before I told Frank. I sat on the edge of my mother's bed with this photograph for a very long time. I brought it to Diane's living room, where she was resting in the chair she'd been resting in since the stroke. I sat across from her and held it up. Her face, when she saw it, did something complicated, a layering of expression that moved across it quickly, surprise and something older than surprise, and then a settling into something I can only describe as the look of a person who has been waiting for a specific conversation for a very long time. "Tell me about Patrice," I said. Her speech was still slightly impeded, though much improved from the early months. She spoke carefully, choosing her words with a deliberateness that the stroke had imposed but that I've since come to think produced a particular kind of precision, a reduction to the essential that her regular speech had sometimes rushed past. Patrice, Diane told me, was her daughter. Her first daughter. Born in 1979, a year before Cora, before Pete, before me. Born when Diane was 25 and not yet married to Frank. Born to a relationship that she described carefully as one she had believed in and been wrong about. Patrice's father was a man named Vincent who Diane had loved and who had, when she told him she was pregnant, told her very clearly and without ambiguity that he would not be present for this. Diane had placed Patrice for adoption. She had made this decision alone, with no family support. Her parents had been unwilling to help, unwilling to take her in, had responded to her pregnancy with the specific, devastating rigidity of a 1979 Catholic household that had not yet made peace with this particular kind of complication. She had been 25 years old and alone, and she had carried a pregnancy and given birth and handed her daughter to a couple whose names she'd been given by the adoption agency and whose faces she'd never seen. And then she had gone back to her apartment and been a person who had done this thing, and she had carried it for the next 40-something years. She told Frank before they married. This is what the photograph's inscription meant. Before she told Frank, Patrice had been a secret she shared only with this woman, Patrice's adoptive mother, with whom Diane had had one meeting, one brief terrifying meeting arranged through the agency, in which she had looked at the woman who was going to raise her daughter, and had handed over something she could not describe and has never fully described, and which I am not going to try to describe because some things belong to the person who lived them and not to anyone else's telling. Frank had known. Her husband, my father, the man with his head on the steering wheel in the parking lot, the man who sold his baseball cards, had known about this and had loved her through it and had never said a word. Not to Pete. Not to me. Not to anyone as far as Diane knew. He had simply taken it in and folded it into his love for her, added it to the full account of who she was, and loved her with the whole of it known. I sat with my mother in her living room for a very long time after she told me this. I thought about all the things I had not known about the people I loved. About the rooms in them I had not known existed. About my father reading those letters upstairs with 2 kids in the apartment, and a job that cost him his body, and a thing his wife had lived through before he knew her, and a love for her that encompassed all of it without reservation. About my mother folding bills into birds every evening, her hands doing the work of her mind, the minds of all of us containing rooms we keep very carefully because the world has not always been safe enough to open them in. I thought about Patrice. This person I had never known existed. This daughter of my mother's who would be in her 40s now, somewhere, living a life she'd been building since 1979, not knowing that her biological mother had a jar of origami birds on a windowsill and a daughter named Lena and a granddaughter named Cora who ran to her grandmother with the completeness of trust. "Have you ever looked for her?" I asked. Diane looked at her hands. Then she said, "I've wondered. Many times." A pause. "After your father died I thought about it. But I was afraid." "Of what?" "That she was fine. Happy. Complete. and that my appearing would disturb something. She looked at me, and that she would not, that she would find it easier to not know. Some people find it easier, and some people don't, I said. Yes, Diane said. Some people don't. I have been thinking about what to do with this knowledge for 3 years. I'm still thinking about it. I want to be honest about the fact that this is not a part of the story that has a clean resolution because life is, in my experience, genuinely less interested in clean resolutions than we are, and giving you a false one would be a disservice to whatever real version of this exists somewhere. What I have done so far is this. I have talked to Diane about it extensively, over the 3 years since the stroke, in the careful circling way of two people approaching something that has been handled very gently for a very long time and is still fragile in its handling. I have asked her questions I never asked before. About Patrice. About Vincent. About what it was like to be a 25-year-old woman in 1979 with no support and a decision she hadn't asked to make. About what she named her in the hospital before she signed the papers because she did name her. She told me she named her Patrice Marie. She needed to give her something even knowing it wouldn't stay. Patrice Marie. My sister who doesn't know I exist. We have talked about whether to look. Diane is not opposed. She has said she would follow my lead, which is a sentence that contains more trust than I know how to repay. This woman who has been deciding things alone since 1979, giving me the decision. I have done some preliminary research, the kind that is available through reunion registries and DNA services, and I have discovered a thing I am not yet ready to tell you in full because it is still in progress, still unfolding, still sitting in the particular suspended state of things that might change everything and that you hold very carefully because you don't want to drop them. What I can tell you is this. There is a woman. She is 45 years old, which is the right age. She lives in Michigan. She has a DNA match in a database that is consistent with what a half-sibling match would look like. I have her name in a document on my computer that I have opened many times and closed without doing anything. I don't know if she wants to be found. I don't know if she's registered on that database because she's looking or because she's curious or because she'd rather know than not know or because she'd rather not know but did it anyway. I don't know what it would mean for her to receive a message from a stranger who says essentially, "Your biological mother is my mother, and she thought about you every day for 45 years and she folded birds from dollar bills and kept them in a jar by the window. I think about it every day. I have composed approximately 50 messages I have not sent. I know, in my journalist's bones, the difference between a story that is ready to be told and one that is still becoming itself, and this one is still becoming itself, and I am trying to be patient with that. But here is what I know as I hold it. Here is what I carry. My mother had a daughter before me who she gave up alone at 25 in 1979, in a world that had given her no good choices. And then she went on to have Pete and me, and she loved us in the full, careful, daily, expensive way of someone who knows what it means to lose. She made us breakfast and folded us birds and showed up in parking lots and drove across town to hold babies and ran laundry without being asked. She carried something enormous and private for 45 years, and she never let it make her smaller. My father knew, and he loved her with the whole of it known, and he drove a truck for 34 years and sold his baseball cards and put his head on the steering wheel in a parking lot when he thought no one was watching, and then lifted his head and drove inside. I want to tell you about the jar. After Diane's stroke, when I was coming to the house regularly, I noticed that the jar on the windowsill was very full. The cranes and swans had accumulated over decades, hundreds of them, pressing against the glass, a dense cloud of small green birds. One afternoon when Diane was resting and I was washing the dishes, something I had started doing just because it needed to be done without being asked, without announcement, which is a behavior that I have come to understand is the truest form of love, I stood at the sink and looked at the jar, and I thought about everything it contained. Every evening she had stood at this sink. Every evening she had taken whatever money was in her pocket and folded it into something else. The fear of the thing transformed into the beauty of the thing. The weight of it held in her hands and changed into something lighter, something that could fly if you opened your hand. I reached into my pocket. I had a $5 bill. I have never been particularly skilled at origami, but I know the basics of a crane. Diane had taught me when I was 7 and I had not done it since, but the fold pattern was still somewhere in my hands the way physical memories stay in hands. I stood at my mother's sink and I folded a small imperfect crane from a $5 bill. It was worse than hers. The wings were uneven, the beak not quite right, but it was recognizably a crane. I opened the lid of the jar and put it in. Diane found it the next day. She came to the kitchen and looked at the jar, and then looked at me and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "You're making birds now." "Trying," I said. She looked at the jar for a moment longer. "Your father used to try sometimes too," she said. "He was terrible at it." She smiled, which was still slightly asymmetric from the stroke, which has become part of how I recognize it as real. "I kept all the bad ones." "Which ones are his?" She pointed. At the back of the jar, pressed against the glass, I could see a handful of cranes that were worse than the others, lopsided, overfolded, the kind of cranes that are clearly made by hands that are trying very hard at something that doesn't come naturally. I had looked at that jar my whole life and never noticed that some of the birds were badly made. I had assumed they were all hers. They weren't. Some of them were his. He had stood at this sink, this man who drove trucks and fixed things and laughed with his whole chest and sold his baseball cards and put his head down and picked it back up. He had stood at this sink and tried to make the things she made, tried to learn her language, tried to inhabit her way of managing the fear. He had been terrible at it. She had kept every one. Cora's 9 now. She is in the 3rd grade and she loves frogs and drawing and the specific type of book that has a complicated female protagonist and a meaningful animal companion, which I have come to understand as a genre in itself. She has Frank's methodical quality and Diane's attentiveness and something that is entirely her own, some internal machinery I can only see the output of, a quality of ethical seriousness, a way of noticing when someone is hurting before they've said anything, a willingness to stand beside a thing and wait for it to show itself. She knows a version of Grandma Dee's story. I've told her parts of it, in the careful way of a parent assessing what a 9-year-old can hold. She knows that Frank worked very hard for our family and that he died before she was old enough to really remember him, but that she knew him in the early years, that she learned some of what she knows about comfort from him. She knows that Grandma Dee is one of the strongest people we will ever know, which she has concluded independently, so when I said it she nodded as if I were confirming a finding. She does not yet know about Patrice. That is a conversation for when she's older, when the story itself is more fully resolved, when I have something more certain to tell. I still fold birds sometimes. In the evenings at the sink after Cora goes to bed and the apartment is quiet and I'm doing the dishes and thinking about whatever the day has left in me that needs processing. I fold them badly, I'm still not good at it, and I put them in a jar on my kitchen windowsill that I bought specifically for this purpose. It's not full yet. There's room. Ferdinand watches me do it with the expression of a cat who finds most human behavior baffling, but has learned to tolerate it. I've been thinking a lot these past few years about transmission, about what passes from one person to another through the medium of being in the same life for long enough. Not genes, not the things you can chart, the other things, the fold patterns. The way Cora says, okay in a murmur when someone she loves is sad. A pattern she received from Frank at 2 years old and uses now with a precision that suggests she has made it hers. The way I stand at a sink and fold things. The way Diane, before her stroke, always arrived somewhere 5 minutes early and with more food than was required. A habit she'd developed in the Columbus years when being prepared was the only buffer between the family and the thing they were afraid of, and that she'd simply continued because it had been good and had no reason to stop. The things that are passed to us by people who are surviving. Not always gracefully, not always in ways that are conscious or explained or even intended. Just passed. Put in our hands. Put in the fold of our habits, in the particular way we stand at a kitchen sink, in the birds we make when we are afraid and need something to do with our hands. I have been the recipient of so much that I didn't have the language to acknowledge. So much that passed through Frank's tired hands and Diane's careful grocery lists and Nora's spare room and Rose Giannopoulos' pot of soup. So much that arrived through Pete's voice on the phone, telling me about a parking lot I hadn't been there for. So much that came from Beverly Crane saying I'm personally sorry, from Ray Holton's quietly reorganized routes, from a woman whose name I never learned putting her hand on my arm in a grocery store in Columbus. That last one didn't happen to me. It happened to a different woman in a different story. But I've thought about her many times, the unnamed woman with the reading glasses on a chain, reaching up for crackers. I've thought about what that kind of attention costs to give it to a stranger. Almost nothing. And what it can be worth on the receiving end. Everything. The opening of everything. I try to be that woman in my own life. I am not always good at it. I have days when I am so consumed by the interior logistics of my own survival that I move through the world with my eyes down, in the specific not seeing of someone who has too much on their internal screen. But I try. I try to look up. I try to see the woman at the pharmacy who's counting out exact change with a deliberateness that tells me she is doing math I know. I try to see the man on the bus who is wearing his work uniform on a Saturday, which means he is one of the people who doesn't get Saturdays. I try to see the kid in the grocery store who is very carefully reading labels on two different products with the focus of someone who has a fixed amount and needs to choose precisely. I try to say something. Not always. Sometimes just being visible in return is enough. Sometimes it's just a look that says, I see you doing this difficult thing and I see that it is difficult, and that is all. You don't need to pretend otherwise in this particular moment. Small gestures. Such small gestures. My father driving my mother across the parking lot in January of 1985. Everything they owned in the truck behind them, toward a cousin's spare room and an unknown future. A pot of soup left outside a door. A route reorganized in silence. A jar of birds on a windowsill, some of them lopsided and overfolded, kept because they were tried. I want to tell you what happened last month. Cora had a school project, an oral history project, 3rd grade, where each kid had to interview a family member about their life. The teacher sent home a list of suggested questions. What was your childhood like? What was the hardest thing you ever went through? What are you most proud of? Cora decided she wanted to interview Diane. She called Diane on the phone and asked the questions with the seriousness of a reporter on assignment, which I watched from the kitchen doorway with a feeling I don't have a word for, something between recognition and gratitude, something about lineage, about the specific transmission of equality across 3 generations. She asked Diane what the hardest thing she'd ever been through was. Diane was quiet for a moment. I could hear it from the kitchen. Then Diane said, making a very hard decision when I was young and very alone, and then getting up and going on. Cora wrote this down. I could hear the pen. Then she said, what do you mean getting up and going on? Diane said, I mean that things happen to us that seem impossible to come back from, and then we come back from them anyway. Not because they weren't terrible, but because we find somehow one person who helps us, or one reason to try, or one small thing we can do with our hands that makes us feel like we have some control. And we do that one small thing, and then another, and we go on. Cora wrote this down. Then she said, Grandma D, were you ever really scared? Diane said, every day for about 2 years. And then less. And then sometimes. And then only when I thought about what might have gone differently. Are you scared now? Another pause. No, my love. Not right now. Right now I'm talking to you. I stood in the kitchen doorway and listened to my daughter interview my mother, and I thought, this is what it was all for. Not my children's comfort for its own sake. Not the absence of difficulty, because Cora has had and will have her own difficulties, and that is the nature of a life lived fully. But this phone call, this continuity, this 9-year-old writing down in her notebook what her grandmother survived, so she will have it, so it will be in her hands, so when she needs it, and she will need it because everyone needs it, she will reach for it and find it there. The project came back with a gold star sticker and a note from the teacher that said, Asterisk Cora. This was one of the most powerful oral histories the class shared. Your grandmother sounds like someone very special. Asterisk. Cora taped it to the refrigerator. I look at it every morning when I make coffee. There is one more thing I want to tell you, and then I'm going to let this go. The week after the oral history project, I was at Diane's house for dinner. Cora was there. Audrey came. She and Diane have maintained their own relationship through everything, and I have made peace with this being complicated, because Cora loves her godmother and Diane has always believed in the full humanity of people who have made mistakes. It was a regular evening, pasta, a movie Cora had been lobbying for, Ferdinand carried in his carrier and immediately escaping under Diane's couch. After Cora was asleep on Diane's living room floor, the way she does sometimes, wrapped in the Afghan Diane has had since the Columbus apartment, Audrey and I sat at the kitchen table while Diane made tea. The 3 of us at the kitchen table, with the jar of birds on the windowsill and the quiet of a house where a child was sleeping. Audrey said suddenly, I never told you something. I looked at her. When you were unemployed, she said. The 8 months. I called your building's landlord. I blinked. I called him, she said. And I told him I was your employer and that you had taken emergency leave but that you were returning to work within the month and that you had a strong employment history and asked him not to start eviction proceedings. I stared at her. He was going to send you a notice, she said. He told Paula, who'd mentioned it, and Paula told me. You were 3 weeks behind on rent and he was going to send a formal notice, and I thought that, I just didn't want you to get that. On top of everything, you were already at the limit, and I thought that one more thing would be. She stopped. I impersonated your employer, she said. Which is probably illegal. And I didn't tell you because I knew you'd refuse it. You'd go pay the man and figure it out yourself, and I decided for you. And I'm sorry I decided for you. But I'm not sorry I did it. I sat at the kitchen table with this woman I'd known for 18 years, who had done something wrong to me and something right for me, who was both things simultaneously, who was not reducible to either thing, and I thought about what it means to be loved by complicated people. Diane set the tea on the table. She had heard. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, people do the best they can. Simple. 4 words. The same 4 words my father had lived by without saying them. The same 4 words that explain a pot of soup outside a door, a reorganized delivery route, a man teaching himself to fold birds because his wife found it a comfort. People do the best they can. The best they can is sometimes not enough. It is sometimes wrong. It is sometimes a betrayal wrapped in love or a rescue that bypasses your permission. The best they can is messy and insufficient and human, and it is also sometimes in certain specific combinations of timing and presence and willingness to try everything. I have a jar on my windowsill. It is not as full as my mother's, and my birds are worse than hers, and Frank's birds were worse than mine, and somewhere in that jar of imperfection there is a record of the things we tried, the evenings we stood at the sink and put our hands to work on something small because the large things were too large to hold directly. I am 41 years old. My daughter is 9 and she is extraordinary. My mother is 67 and still here, still folding, still arriving early with more food than needed. My brother Pete calls on Thursday evenings and asks how things are going and waits for the actual answer. Audrey comes for dinner more often than not. Dov is in my past in the way of things that were real and incomplete, which is the most honest thing I can say about it. Somewhere in Michigan there is possibly a woman who is 45 years old and has my mother's dark eyes and a life she's been building since 1979. And I have her name in a document I open and close and open again, and I am still learning how to do the thing I'm trying to do, which is step towards something that might change everything with enough gentleness that if she needs time, I will have left her the room for it. I think about Frank's head on the steering wheel. I think about him picking it up and driving inside. I think about all the things that required that quality, the picking up and going in, and about how long it can take to understand what you're watching when you're watching it from the back seat, too young to know what anything costs, not yet in possession of the life that will teach you. My parents raised me alone after losing everything, and I never understood how hard that was until I was doing it too. Until I was doing it too. That is the whole sentence. That is all of it. Not just the acknowledgement of what they did, but the specific mechanism by which I came to acknowledge it, through my own version of the same struggle, through being in the soup myself, through standing at the sink with my hands full of money I was afraid of and needing to do something with my hands, something small, something I could manage, something that might become beautiful if I let it. Understanding is not a gift. You don't receive it by being thoughtful or well-intentioned or even by loving people correctly. You receive it by living long enough and hard enough that the experience does the instructing that words could not. You receive it by finding yourself in the parking lot at the edge of something enormous and having someone, a stranger, a best friend, a mother on the phone, a dispatcher moving routes in silence, step toward you. And then later, when you know what it cost, when you have paid your own version of the price, you step toward someone else. You step toward someone else. That is the whole of it. That is what the birds are. That is what the soup and the cake and the reorganized routes and the 4 pages of handwritten honesty and the 5-minute phone call from a parking lot are. That is what Frank was doing in the cab of his truck in January of 1985, with his head on the steering wheel and his wife and his children waiting inside and the weight of everything they'd lost pressing on his chest. He was gathering what he had, which was not very much by certain measures and was by others the whole world, and he was getting ready to take it inside and put it on the table and say, "This is what I have. Here, take it. I mean it." And then he picked his head up. And he drove inside. Asterisk, if you're somewhere right now with your head on the wheel, you'll pick it up. And if there's a person in the back seat watching you and not understanding, maybe someday they will. And maybe they'll fold a bird from a $5 bill in a kitchen that is theirs and think of you. And maybe that's enough. I think that's enough. Asterisk. Thank you for reading.